Part 1. The Commander. He didn't just get confessions, he manufactured them. Electric shock to the genitals, cattle prods forced into mouths, plastic bags pulled over heads until the body went limp, mock executions with shotguns, burning skin against hot radiators, beatings with telephone books, flashlights, batons, and baseball bats. For over 2 decades, from the early 1970s through the early 1990s, a Chicago police commander named John Burge and a group of detectives under his command tortured at least 118 black men into false confessions at Area 2 and Area 3 police headquarters on the south side of Chicago. They called themselves the Midnight Crew. Burge was a Vietnam War veteran. He served as a military police investigator at a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam. The techniques he learned there, sensory deprivation, stress positions, electric shock, he brought home to Chicago. He joined the Chicago Police Department in March of 1970. By 1972, he was a detective assigned to Area 2, the station covering some of the poorest and most violent neighborhoods on the South Side. He brought Vietnam home with him. The first known victim of electric shock torture under Burge's command was a man named Anthony Holmes. It was May 30th, 1973. Holmes was 24 years old. The detectives attached electrodes to his body and sent current through him until he confessed. Years later, Holmes described the experience in testimony. He said the pain was like grabbing a live wire. He said his body convulsed so violently he thought his heart would stop. He said the detectives laughed while they did it. Holmes's complaint didn't come to light for 16 years. Nobody investigated. Nobody asked questions. Nobody checked. Because the men Burge tortured were black. They were poor. Many had criminal records. Some were gang members. Some were not. All of them were suspects in violent crimes. And in the 1970s and 1980s on the south side of Chicago, that was enough. All of them were suspects in violent crimes. And in the 1970s and 1980s on the south side of Chicago, that was enough. The department had a term they used internally for cases involving people like Burge's victims. NHI, no human involved. That was the institutional context in which John Burge operated for 20 years without consequence. The electric shock device became so routine that the detectives gave it a name. They called it the black box. They also called it something else, a term so racist it told you everything you needed to know about who was being tortured and why. The methods were deliberate. Burge didn't use techniques that left visible marks. Telephone books don't bruise, plastic bags don't scar, electric current leaves no entry wound. The men who walked out of those interrogation rooms carried the evidence inside their bodies, inside their minds, where no judge or jury could see it. And every single time, they emerged with a signed confession. Prosecutors never questioned how Burge obtained confessions at a rate that no other detective in the department could match. They never asked why suspects who entered the interrogation room denying everything emerged hours later confessing to multiple murders in vivid detail. They used those confessions to build careers. Part 2. The Victims. On February 14, 1982, Valentine's Day, a man named Andrew Wilson was arrested for the murder of 2 Chicago police officers. The city was furious. The law enforcement community wanted blood. Then Mayor Jane Byrne personally oversaw the manhunt. John Burge was put in charge of the case. Wilson was brought to Area 2 Police Headquarters. Top police brass and key deputies of Cook County State's Attorney Richard M. Daley were at the station house. Daley received periodic updates from his subordinates throughout the day as the interrogation progressed. Throughout the day, Burge and his men tortured Wilson until he confessed. They handcuffed him across a hot radiator. They sent electric current through his ears, his lip, his genitals, his back, and his fingers, causing him to flinch and sustain burns on his chest, thighs, and chin from the radiator beneath him. They pulled a plastic garbage bag over his head and suffocated him. They beat him about the head and body. They burned him with a cigarette. They cocked a revolver and placed it in his mouth. When Wilson arrived at Cook County Jail, the medical director, Dr. John Raba, examined him. He noted a battered right eye, bruises, swelling, abrasions on his face and head, blisters on his right thigh, cheek, and chest consistent with radiator burns. Unlike most of Burge's victims, whose torture was concealed by methods that intentionally left no marks, Wilson had visible, irrefutable proof on his body. Dr. Raba was troubled enough to write a letter. He sent it to Chicago Police Superintendent Richard Brzezek. He detailed Wilson's injuries. He requested an investigation. Brzezek forwarded the letter to State's Attorney Richard M. Daley. Daley never responded. Brzezek told Daley he would not investigate unless Daley directed him to do so. Daley never directed him. No investigation was opened. No charges were filed. No officers were questioned. Instead, Daley publicly commended Burge for his work on the Wilson case. As a result of Daley's refusal to act in 1982, at least 70 more black men were tortured by Burge and the detectives under his command over the next decade. If Daley had acted, if he had opened an investigation when the jail doctor put the evidence in writing, the torture would have ended that year. He chose not to. Richard M. Daley went on to become mayor of Chicago. He served for 22 years. He built Millennium Park. He rebuilt Navy Pier. He was celebrated as the man who stabilized the city. He never apologized to the torture victims, not when the special prosecutor found that Burge tortured with impunity, not when Burge was indicted, not when Burge was convicted, not once. On October 28, 1983, a man named Gregory Banks was arrested for murder and brought to Area 2. Detective Peter Dignan, one of Burge's crew, took over questioning. Before placing a plastic bag over Banks's head and suffocating him, Dignan told him one thing: "We've got something for you." Then Dignan told him exactly what kind of person that something was meant for. He used one word. Banks never forgot it. Banks confessed. He was sentenced to 50 years. 5 days later, November 2, 1983, 3 members of Burge's crew arrested a man named Darrell Cannon. They drove him to an isolated area near railroad tracks on the south side. They stood him up in the road with his hands cuffed behind his back. One officer held out a 10-inch cattle prod. Another held a pump-action shotgun. They pressed the cattle prod to his testicles repeatedly. They rammed the shotgun barrel into his mouth and pulled the trigger 3 times. Each time, Cannon heard the click of an empty chamber. Each time, he believed he was about to die. They called him one word throughout the interrogation, the same word the detectives used for every man who sat in those rooms. Eventually, Cannon confessed to a murder he says he did not commit. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life. He spent 24 years in prison, 9 of them in solitary confinement at TAMS, the super maximum security facility. He was exonerated in 2004. In 1986, while still in prison, Cannon had filed a handwritten complaint in federal court alleging torture. His court-appointed lawyer, who knew nothing about the pattern of abuse at Area 2, advised him to settle. He accepted $3,000. He netted $1,247 for 24 years. In 1985, a man named Leroy Orange was convicted of stabbing 2 people. He said his confession was extracted through beating and electric shock at Area 2. He said he had left the victims alive and well the night of the crime. The officers denied the charges at trial. The judge sentenced Orange to death. In 1988, Ronald Kitchen was 21 years old. He lived on the south side with his girlfriend and their young son. On the night of his arrest, he was walking to the corner store to buy cookies for the boy. Chicago police pulled up beside him. They told him to get in the car. He told his girlfriend he would be back in 45 minutes. They drove him to Area 2. For the first 2 hours, the detectives asked him questions about a quintuple homicide. 5 people murdered in a house fire on the south side. Kitchen told them he didn't know anything about it. He had never heard of the victims. He had no connection to the address. The detectives left the room. When they came back, they brought the black box. For the next 14 hours, Kitchen was subjected to electric shock, suffocation, and sustained beating. They shocked his genitals. They put a plastic bag over his head until he lost consciousness. When he came to, they shocked him again. They told him they would kill him if he didn't confess. They told him nobody knew where he was. They told him nobody was coming. Kitchen held out for hours longer than most men could. Then his body broke. He confessed to 5 murders he had never heard of before that night. The confession was detailed. It named the victims. It described the method. It included information that Kitchen could not have known unless the detectives fed it to him during the interrogation, which is exactly what they did. Prosecutors used that confession to seek the death penalty. The jury never heard about the black box. They never heard about the 16 hours. They never heard about the plastic bags or the electric shock. They heard a signed confession. Ronald Kitchen was sentenced to death. He was 21 years old. His son grew up without him. He learned to walk without his father in the room. He started school without his father at the door. He became a teenager without his father at the table. Kitchen spent 13 years on death row at Pontiac Correctional Center. He woke up every morning in a cell knowing he had been sentenced to die for something he did not do. It took 21 years before a reinvestigation of his case revealed the coercion. In 2009, he received a certificate of innocence. The charges were dropped. He walked out of prison a 42-year-old man. He had gone in to buy cookies for his son. Kitchen was not alone. At least 10 men tortured by Burge and his crew were sentenced to death. They were scattered across the Illinois prison system. Different facilities, different cell blocks, different yards. Most of them had never met each other. Kitchen was not alone. At least 10 men tortured by Burge and his crew were sentenced to death. They were scattered across the Illinois prison system. Different facilities, different cell blocks, different yards. Most of them had never met each other. But they all had the same story, the same interrogation rooms, the same methods, the same commander. In 1999, they found each other through their lawyers and through word passed between cell blocks. They gave themselves a name, the Death Row 10. They began writing coordinated letters to journalists, to politicians, to civil rights organizations, to anyone who would listen. They filed appeals. They organized from cells where they were locked down 23 hours a day. They communicated through legal mail and through attorneys who carried messages between facilities. Individually, each man was easy to ignore. A convicted murderer claiming his confession was coerced. The system heard that every day, but 10 men telling the same story about the same commander using the same methods in the same interrogation rooms, that was something different. And slowly, the world began to listen. Part 3. The Cover-Up. The first crack in the wall came from inside the department itself. During Andrew Wilson's civil lawsuit against the city, his lawyers at the People's Law Office received anonymous letters from a police source they would later call Deep Badge. Deep Badge disclosed names of officers who participated in torture. He identified their methods. He gave them nicknames, calling Burge's inner circle the Ass Kickers. He identified a man named Melvin Jones as another torture victim, one who had been shocked by Burge just 9 days before Wilson. Following Deep Badge's leads, the lawyers tracked down 25 additional black men who alleged they were tortured at Area 2, confirming that Wilson's torture was not an isolated incident, but one instance in a systematic pattern of racist abuse. The first journalist to publish the full story was John Conroy of the Chicago Reader. In 1990, he published an article called House of Screams. He documented the systematic torture at Area 2 in clinical, devastating detail. The city denied everything. In 1991, Amnesty International issued a report calling for an inquiry into police torture in Chicago. Then Mayor Daley responded with no comment whatsoever. In 1992, the Office of Professional Standards, Chicago's internal police review body, completed its investigation. It found 50 documented cases of torture and abuse at Area 2 under Burge's command. It described the abuse as systematic, methodological, and stated that it included psychological techniques and planned torture. 50 documented cases, systematic, planned. The Chicago Police Board voted to fire Burge in February of 1993. That same year, the local Fraternal Order of Police made plans to honor Burge and 4 other officers accused of torture with a parade float. The police union tried to put the man who tortured 118 men on a float. Burge moved to Florida. He collected his pension, $3,039 a month. He lived in a house near Tampa. He went fishing. He grilled in his backyard. And the men he tortured stayed in prison. In November 1999, reporters Steve Mills and Ken Armstrong of the Chicago Tribune published A Tortured Path to Death Row, an investigation into the Death Row 10 and their allegations against Burge. The story laid out the pattern in devastating detail. Same techniques, same detectives, same station, over and over. The story reached national television. 60 Minutes covered it. Nightline covered it. Oprah covered it. The pressure became unbearable. For years, prosecutors, defense attorneys, civil rights organizations, and journalists pushed for criminal charges against Burge. Every time, the same answer. The statute of limitations had expired. John Burge could not be charged with torture, not because there wasn't evidence, not because there weren't witnesses, not because the system didn't know, because too much time had passed. The system that allowed the torture to continue for 2 decades then used the passage of that same time to shield the torturer from prosecution. In 2008, 26 years after Andrew Wilson was burned on a radiator while the state's attorney received updates down the hall, federal prosecutors found something they could charge: perjury. In a 2003 civil lawsuit, Burge had been asked under oath whether he had tortured suspects. He said no. That was a lie. And unlike torture, the statute of limitations on lying under oath had not expired. On June 28, 2010, John Burge was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison. 4.5 years. Darrell Cannon served 24. Ronald Kitchen served 21. At least 20 other men remained behind bars on confessions they gave under torture. Burge served his time. He was released early. He returned to Florida. He continued to collect his pension until the day he died. He died on September 19, 2018. He was 70 years old. He never apologized. He never admitted to torturing anyone. He kept his pension to the end. Part 4. The Reckoning. After Burge's conviction, the movement for accountability accelerated. In January 2003, Governor George Ryan, 3 days before leaving office, made a decision that shook the American criminal justice system. He commuted every death sentence in the state of Illinois, every single one, 167 inmates removed from death row. He pardoned 4 Burge torture victims outright: Madison Hobley, Aaron Patterson, Leroy Orange, and Stanley Howard. He cited the systemic failures that had put innocent men on death row. He cited the torture. The Death Row 10 didn't just fight for themselves. They forced an entire state to confront what its justice system had become. 10 men in cells, writing letters, filing appeals, telling the same story until the world couldn't look away. They changed the law from behind bars. In 2005, frustrated by the pace of the investigation, attorneys and representatives appeared before the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights of the Organization of American States. Survivors testified. They presented evidence of systematic torture by American police officers on American soil to an international body because American institutions had refused to act. In 2015, after years of organizing by torture survivors, activists, and legal advocates, the Chicago City Council passed a historic reparations ordinance. It was the first municipal reparations measure for police torture victims in American history. The ordinance established a $5.5 million fund for 57 identified torture survivors. It required Chicago public schools to teach the Burge torture cases in their curriculum. It provided free enrollment at city colleges for survivors and their families. It created a permanent public memorial. Darrell Cannon received a reparations check. After 24 years in prison, after a $1,200 settlement that was supposed to make him whole, after a lifetime of nightmares about a shotgun barrel in his mouth and a cattle prod against his body. He said the money was meaningless until every torture survivor still behind bars was free. "The glass is only half full," he said. "There's still another half to go." As of the most recent reporting, at least 20 men remain in prison on convictions obtained through confessions coerced by John Burge and the Midnight Crew. 20 men, still inside, still waiting. Chicago taxpayers have paid over $130 million in lawsuit settlements, legal fees, and judgments related to John Burge's conduct. $130 million. Not 1 cent came from John Burge. He kept his pension. He retired to Florida. He went fishing. He died in his sleep. And the men he tortured, the men who confessed to crimes they did not commit because a police commander put a cattle prod to their bodies and a shotgun in their mouths, some of them are still waiting for the system that destroyed their lives to admit what it did. 118 men, at least 10 sentenced to death, 20 still inside. 4.5 years for the man who did it. $3,000 a month until the day he died. Finally solved.